Paul Kalanithi, I don't know if you've heard of him, he wrote a book while he was dying. And I think he had a basic faith to him, but I never knew him, so I don't know that for sure. I recommend his book, not because it is in and of itself a good resource from a Catholic perspective. In fact, some of the things that come across in the book would contravene what we hold. But I would just point to it because it really puts the flesh on this problem of death and dying. And the fact that when death comes, it doesn't come on our terms. So I take a segment of his book to start out with. I flipped through the CAT scan images. The diagnosis obvious. The lungs were matted with innumerable tumors, the spine deformed, a full lobe of the liver obliterated, cancer widely disseminated. I was a neurosurgical resident entering my final year of training. Over the last 6 years, I examined scores of such scans on the off chance that some procedure might benefit the patient. But this scan was different. It was my own. I wasn't in the radiology suite wearing my scrubs and white coat. I was dressed in a patient's gown, tethered to an IV pole, using the computer the nurse had left in my hospital room with my wife, Lucy, an internist at my side. I went through each sequence again. The lung window, the bone window, the liver window, scrolling from top to bottom, then left to right, then front to back, just as I had been trained to do, as if I might find something that would change the diagnosis. We lay together on the hospital bed, Lucy quietly, as if reading from a script. Do you think there's any possibility that it's something else? No, I said. We held each other tightly like young lovers. In the past year, we'd both suspected but refused to believe or even discuss that a cancer was growing inside of me. I take that quote from the prologue of Paul Kalanithi's book, When Breath Becomes Air, which was published in 2016. So he very, very recently died. We're all going to die. But do I have the right to take my life, given undue suffering? Salvifici Dolores was written by John Paul II. It was an apostolic letter early in his papacy, closely linked in some ways to his letter on human dignity. And in there, he shows that suffering, when we go back to the Greek as it was used in antiquity, suffering is a verb, to suffer. Paskein, the infinitive form of the verb, to suffer. Suffering is permanent a part of my human nature as anything else. To suffer, to be able to suffer. To be able to be affected by things outside of myself. So in the Greek of antiquity, if the prefix was you, like eustress versus distress, if the prefix was you, it meant I'm suffering something very nice. I happily suffered being invited to speak here to you all today. I happily suffered my promotion at work today. I was happily affected by my superior who let me come to Chicago to serve at the University of Illinois at Chicago and live in a wonderful Dominican priory, St. Pius V in Pilsen. I've happily suffered many things. The many times I jumped out of airplanes as a paratrooper, every time, thanks be to God, I happily suffered not being injured. Okay? There are also things we suffer that aren't so happy, that aren't so joyful, like what we see referred to by the now deceased Dr. Kalanithi. The pains, the thorns. And we want to take that very, very seriously. I'm sure you've all lost loved ones. And you've probably all seen something of what that looks like, I'm quite sure. And doesn't it seem quite apparent that suffering itself, in and of itself, as experienced by the subject, okay, doesn't always have religious value? Actually, in a deeper sense, it certainly can. By the power of God's grace, by the power of the fact that we participate. This is part of our suffering at every moment of our existence. We participate His sustaining action that holds us in being and existence. But if I don't realize that, I can think that this thing I'm suffering right now has no meaning, no value. It's completely absurd. And so I ought to be able to do whatever I desire to do to end it. Hey, to get out of a bad situation, it's not unreasonable. But if my major premise, if my major start point about the thing that's confronting me is somehow flawed, I'll end up taking some decisions by which I can destroy myself and even possibly incorporate others in my self-destruction, which would have implications in their lives as well. Why not escape? Escape and evade. In the military, we have something called SEER School, which is all about survival, escape, resistance, evasion. Army Rangers, Special Forces soldiers, Navy SEALs, naval aviators, they all go through it so that they can learn how to escape and evade capture by an enemy. So to evade something is not always bad. So why not be able to escape this terrible suffering? Well, we're going to look at a few key terms, basically some distinctions, and some cases by which we're going to flesh those out. And that's going to help us go somewhere. And then we're going to open up for Q&A. But before we start with those distinctions, I want to start with a prayer. It's actually a poem. It's entitled Abide With Me, and it was written by a poet named H.F. Light. And there is a section in the back of our breviary, our prayer books, out of which we pray Liturgy of the Hours every day, of poetry, and it's in there. Hear this out as a moment of prayer. Abide with me. Fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens. Lord, abide with me. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. Swift to its close ebbs out life's little day. Earth's joys grow dim. Its glories pass away. Change and decay in all around I see. O thou who changest not, abide with me. Hold thou thy cross before my closing eyes. Shine through the gloom and point me to the skies. Heaven's morning breaks and earth's vain shadows flee. In life, in death, O Lord, abide with me. The divine presence. There are four useful, this is not why they're good, they're actually useful because they're true. There are four useful distinctions. There are many more, but in the interest of time, I've pared it down to four that we're going to deal with today that can be really helpful in thinking through in real time, in context, right? Making sure that the nature of the action I'm taking is a good one, regardless of what the circumstances may be, but taking those circumstances of illness and other factors quite seriously, and as a part of that, having the best of intentions. These distinctions can help us think very clearly in pretty distressing situations that in some respects are haze gray. But gray is a combination of dark and light, black and white. So we'll see some objective truth here, but we're going to see it fleshed out in ways all too real. And hold your questions. When I get done, I'm going to open the floor. So the four distinctions are these: vitalistic versus euthanistic action, artificial versus disproportionate action, intrinsic dignity versus attributed dignity, and freedom for excellence versus autonomy. So first we look at vitalistic, considered vis-a-vis euthanistic action. And here, you know the old saying, virtus in medio stat, virtue lies in the middle. Sometimes pro-lifers have a risk of becoming a bit vitalistic. Sometimes, often, but not always, pro-choicers legislatively can slip into euthanistic thought. I want to look back at something that Father had mentioned. He was talking a bit about abortion. I'm going to start there really, really quickly. Think about the fact that roughly 90% of human beings conceived with Down syndrome are being put to death in utero. Well, you can refer to this as abortion. You can also refer to it as intrauterine, non-voluntary on the point of the smaller of the two human beings involved. You could call it intrauterine, non-voluntary euthanasia. You could also call it, from the standpoint of the mother, you could call it intrauterine, voluntary euthanasia. We can play around with these. And when we think about it, we see that euthanistic mindset that I'm going to define here in just about a minute is at play. It's never too far away. So vitalistic versus euthanistic action. Vitalism basically holds that a person's life shall be prolonged as long as possible, no matter what. Now, many people today who attack the church as they understand it are doing so because they're actually very intelligent. They're not understanding everything. What they're attacking is not the church. They're attacking a false understanding of what the church holds. Right? They hear pro-life. They may not know the technical term here, but they think vitalism. They see people writhing in pain. They see people's reasonable decisions at risk, and they react. On the other extreme, we have a euthanistic mindset. Euthanasia, as defined by the church, and you can see this, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, in its declaration on euthanasia, which was put out on the 5th of May, 1980, this is sort of the Catholic textbook definition of what euthanasia is, and it's very clear. It is an action or an omission which of itself or by intention causes death in order that all suffering in this way may be eliminated. In this way may be eliminated. So, an action. So maybe I give you a lethal dose of something. Okay? Or an omission. Maybe I withhold fluids. Maybe I withhold reasonable approaches to helping you maintain a kind of a balanced nutritional status, the best we can do, even as you're dying. Okay? That I do that not because I'm understanding that you're now actively dying, but because I want to kill you to end your suffering. Okay? That's euthanistic activity. And not all people who are pro-choice are pro-euthanasia or pro-assisted suicide, but there's a kind of logic where oftentimes they do go together. But you may have someone who is for something like euthanasia or assisted suicide, which I'll touch on in just a moment, because of this misconception or this perceived threat that it is real. There are vitalists out there. There are. And they get it wrong. So it's a kind of a Hegelian sic et non, a this or that. It's like we either hold this or we either hold that. Where's the middle ground? Classically, euthanasia didn't mean what it currently means at all. He used to talk about a holy, even a sanctified or sanctifying, beautiful death. You know? Euthanatos, a good death, a happy death. Maybe something like hagiathanatos, a holy death even. So it's not about fleeing the inevitable. But that gets caught up. Now, assisted suicide basically is a form of euthanasia. A clinician prescribes a means by which I can kill myself with or without the additional assistance of others. It's basically self-administered euthanasia. If the physician gives the means by which I can kill myself, but I can't quite bring myself to do it, but I ask my friend to do it for me, then it's euthanasia. Because my friend is now killing me rather than me killing myself. But it's basically the same thing. So we're going to talk a little bit here. We're going to consider a case. Let me take a segue really quickly. I passed out, don't think there are quite enough. I passed out a copy of the sources that I'm using today. The main sources for this presentation, these are the sources out of which pretty much all my case data, the theology behind what I'm doing, you can find it in these sources. And then there are end-of-life sources, which I also list, which are free and accessible online. Hold your questions, we'll get there. But I've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to stay close to the script. So, the increase of a basal rate of morphine sulfate. What do we know about morphine? It's a powerful opioid analgesic. It causes respiratory depression. It can shut your bowel activity down. It's got no theoretical skyward limit because of the way it works pharmacodynamically. So with it, like other opiates, to continue to achieve a proper efficacy, you've got to slowly over time, usually, increase a little bit so that as the patient you're ministering to is perhaps actively dying, okay, you're keeping that patient comfortable. So it's a fine balance. Now the names are changed here, so don't worry. All the names are changed. Mrs. Lee was very close to death at the end of her long battle with metastatic breast cancer. After about a 9-month period of remission, her cancer had returned with a vengeance. And yet neither she nor her family had fallen into despair. As a practicing Roman Catholic, she and her family, they had responded very well to our in-house Catholic chaplain. Mrs. Lee and her family were realistically facing her impending death with prayer, hope, trust, and confidence in God's mercy. You see here that she was deeply rooted, as were the members of her family, in what Buber would call the I-thou relationship. God is always reaching out. We're suffering this at every moment. God always wants to unite with us. And she was rooted in that. None of us were surprised when Mrs. Lee requested to be placed on do not resuscitate and do not intubate orders. She was beyond the need to place her hopes in interventions that would have been disproportionate, futile, traumatic. And that matters. She was beyond a hope for cure. She was in a phase where she was starting to shut down by body system. She was what we call actively dying. And sometimes that can go on for a week, 2 weeks. That can take a while. This is where we see hospice, you know. This is why people go to hospice, okay? So it's not wrong to say, I don't want that breathing tube. It's not wrong to say, I don't want you to do CPR if my heart stops. Hey, when I was a medic, an EMT actually, between my Army and Navy years while I was studying nursing, I worked for about 3.5 years in an emergency room, And I did CPR on hundreds of people. And I saw the absurdity. When there we have rolling in on an ambulance rig, an 85-year-old osteoporotic woman whose bones are very brittle, like a little bird, And I know, but she doesn't have a do not resuscitate order. So we need to code her. And I know that no matter how textbook perfect, my first chest compression is, you know what I feel as a clinician? And you know what I hear? Crunch. All the bones break around the sternum. And with that first compression, I have just caved her chest in. Now, remember, she's clinically, in a sense, dead. Although anybody who can be brought back is not dead yet theologically. Unless there's an honest-to-God miracle. But we know that we're using CPR when somebody's heart has stopped and their breathing has stopped. And so, again, here we see a distinction between maybe something kind of vitalistic. We'll get into the euthanistic in a while. Although we knew that Mrs. Lee was actively dying, none of us realized that she would die, actually, before the end of our day. I was charge nurse that day, and as usually, I began the day with morning report followed by my rounds. Upon entering Mrs. Lee's room, I immediately noticed that she was, as had been the case for the previous few days, unresponsive to voice, touch, and painful stimuli. Mrs. Lee was unable to provide us with subjective information regarding her present state of comfort or lack thereof. Neither I, the nurse team leader, nor the enlisted clinician found any objective signs of pain upon physical assessment. Things like blood pressure, all that stuff. Now, she was actively dying. But there was nothing to indicate she was anything but comfortable. Now, later that morning, about 3 hours later, I received a written order from a physician, actually a good friend of mine, to whom I'll refer as Dr. Humphrey. I refer to him as Dr. Humphrey with a kind of a little gallows humor or analog here. Derek Humphrey founded the Hemlock Society quite a few years ago. Compassion and Choices. More on that maybe a little bit later. But I refer to this doctor as Humphrey for a reason. So he wanted us to increase Mrs. Lee's basal rate of morphine sulfate. And based upon those earlier assessment findings, I thought I'd better go review the bedside notes of both the nurse team leader and the enlisted clinician, in this case an AV corpsman, to see if something had changed. No changes had been noted and no consultations with a physician had been documented. Upon reassessing Mrs. Lee myself, I found no significant changes in any of these objective signs from our earlier assessment. And so I then spoke to her husband, didn't divulge too much, just to see what he thought, how he thought she was doing, hear his opinion. And he thought that she looked peaceful and comfortable. Now her breathing was getting into a respiratory pattern that happens near death, which can be quite alarming. But other than those little bit of moments when that would kick in, she was looking pretty good for a dying woman. Now, upon leaving the room, I documented my findings and told the nurse team leader not to implement the order until I clarified it with Dr. Humphrey. Now, it's important to note that Catholic teaching holds that so long as the death of the patient is not intended, but merely accepted as a possibility of an intervention intended to help the patient experience optimal comfort, it is morally perfectly fine to intervene in this manner. So I needed to achieve clarity with Dr. Humphrey because he's a physician, I'm a nurse at the time, and he's got a perspective. I may be missing something. Maybe we should implement the order, but given our perspective, the order seems disproportionate to the lived reality being expressed as insofar as it could be by the patient and the husband. So as we work toward that clarity, and I'll just cut to the chase here, I don't think I'll ever forget. We went into the conference room, and we were friends. I mean, we'd been through the Navy's, this was after nursing school, after my Army years. We'd been through the combat casualty care course together and advanced trauma life support training, and all that stuff is naval officers. He a medical corps officer, me a nurse corps officer. So we were good friends, good colleagues. And as only good friends can do, we had a really tense conversation because we could go there and not hold bad grudges or something after. We could really get down to it. But I don't think I'll ever forget his pinnacle remark made with great intensity. At one point, I said, do you intend, is this order intended? We discussed all the data. I said, is this order intended to hasten her death? And he put his head down in his hand, and he was distressed by this. And he said, all I know is that if that were my mother in that bed, I would want to at least be able to treat her as humanely as a veterinarian is able to treat a dog that must be put down. Why do we treat people worse than we treat animals? Close quote. We both fell silent for what felt like an eternity. I'm going to stop that case right there. In that comment made by Dr. Humphrey, at his moment of moral and ethical and even spiritual distress, kind of feeling a sense of being overwhelmed by what's confronting him. And he was a young physician. This happens. It's okay. It's just when it happens, we have to think through it, right? He definitely wanted to kill the patient, but on grounds of what you might call a false sense of compassion. Compassion is to really walk with the one suffering in a way more or less profoundly united to that person, and if you will, accompany, carry, whatever the case may be. Okay? And, you know, Rita Marker, who founded an organization, and it's one of the organizations I list in the online references there, called the Patient Rights Council, wrote a book entitled Deadly Compassion, probably a good 25 years ago now, maybe even longer, and it was about the death of Anne Wickett Humphrey. Anne Wickett Humphrey was Derek Humphrey's late wife. Derek Humphrey, who founded the Hemlock Society, and about her act of suicide and how that played out, and Rita's good friendship with Anne, and it kind of shows something of the face of that. So that's called Deadly Compassion by Rita Marker. So, vitalism on the one hand, which we don't see in this case, and the euthanistic actions on the other hand, which we do see in this case. But the good news is this physician followed suit with what we thought should be done. I said, well, if you want to intervene that way, you have to do it. We're not going to do it, and that's going to be documented. And he thought about it, and he went and he discontinued the order. Now, she died later that shift. And the pragmatist might say, well, what difference does it make? Well, it makes a lot of difference because of the nature of the action in question. We heard a bit about natural law. You could talk about it this way. When I was at Dartmouth College, I spent a year there and I did outreach to interested students at the Geisel School of Medicine there. I call it human nature-based reasoning. Human nature can be thumbnail sketched. This goes back to Cicero and others. Father alluded to that. Gets picked up by Aquinas and others moving forward. There's an inclination toward wanting to obtain the good. There's an inclination to want to know the truth. Do you like to be lied to? No. Do you like things that you know are bad for you? No. You might choose some things that are bad for you, but if you're going to choose them, you're usually doing it under some false notion of the good. This is recognized by Aquinas and others. Inclination to self-preservation. Doesn't mean we have to be vitalistic, but this is the basic inclination toward life. Contraception? Hey, it doesn't go with our human nature on a specific level. If we took that to its radical conclusion, we'd be functionally extinct as a species very quickly. Individual level, inclination to self-preservation, inclination to life, that basic inclination is violated if we, in that case, had done that order with the intent and with the nature of the action itself to actually kill a patient. Inclination to live in society. We're social animals. Is it fair? Is it reasonable of me to say, hey, would you help me kill myself? That's a good question. I don't mean to demonize people who are struggling with suicidal ideation, people who've committed suicide. Hey, we have to be careful about harsh judgment of souls, but we know one thing for sure. An act of suicide, in and of itself, regardless of terrible circumstances, illness, whatever the case may be, psychological, psychiatric issues, that's all recognized. And it's tragic, right? How do I know it's tragic? Because it directly violates this basic inclination. of self-preservation and to live in society. If I kill myself, what does that say of my recognition of my place right now? And sometimes it's done in problematic ways with that in mind as well. We'll touch on that a little bit later. And then, of course, we're not going to touch on this today too much, but the inclination to sexual union and marriage. Again, both individual and specific level. And the marital bond and all that stuff. So, again, vitalism and euthanasia. Vitalistic and euthanistic actions. So let's think a minute where we can sometimes get really confused. Well, doesn't the church say that a tube feeding is ordinary, so it always has to be done? No, the church doesn't actually say that. I can nuance that. Food and fluids are ordinary. They are. And usually, whether we're talking about a nasogastric tube, a PEG tube, a gastrostomy tube, any of those, what we're putting through those tubes is something like Ensure or Boost. Things that I can drink out of a can. There's nothing unusual about what we're giving the patient, but it is highly artificial. And if you look at like the ethical and religious directives for Catholic health care, and what constitutes, what helps us think about, should this be done in this case? Should this be continued in this case? We can also think about the breathing tubes, endotracheal tubes, nasotracheal tubes, various ways in which we can help a patient breathe, right? And other options. So we want to think a little bit about a distinction now between artificial and disproportionate human action. So are artificial interventions or care modalities de facto extraordinary, or in some way beyond the call of duty? We're going to see that they are not. Are they de facto in their artificiality? Yeah, having a tube placed on my nose, that's artificial. There's no doubt about it. And sometimes it's imprudent and the wrong thing to do, but not because of its artificiality. So is it always disproportionate? Is it always imprudent? No, absolutely not. Again, food and fluids, oxygen, all of these things are fully consistent with how I'm natured as a human being. Nothing exists to annihilate itself. So I need oxygen, I need food, I need hydration, I need fluids. So let's think about three things. I want to talk for a moment about horses, buses, and tubes. If you guys heard Chicago Tonight, I think is the show on WTTW. I think it certainly within the last couple of weeks, they're talking about this tube that people are thinking about building for this super high-speed travel that would link Chicago to Columbus, Ohio to Pittsburgh. And it's basically like a vacuum tube. They've done testing on it. And they don't know if it's realistic. The engineers, they got to keep looking at it. But it's a kind of a cool theoretical concept. A tube is something by which something is transported. Boom! In this case, it would be me going to a Pittsburgh Steelers game. Oh yeah, to watch them beat the Dallas Cowboys or something like that. You're back, circa 1978. Franco Harris. Anyway, I got that tube, and then I can come back and watch Walter Payton. Just like that, in a tube. We've got buses, right? This makes it a little more down to earth. Would it be more sort of well-proportioned or considered ordinary for a kid to take a school bus to Benito Juarez High School in my Pilsen neighborhood, maybe from two neighborhoods over? Or would it be more ordinary and better proportioned for him to ride a horse? The horse would be patently extraordinary, and yet there's nothing artificial about a horse, right? And yet the school bus is artificial. It's not an organic thing. It's not a living organism, right? It's put together completely by artifice, but that's ordinary. So sometimes it's helpful to start with what we know, right? So the next case is about a tube feeding that we discontinued, and we'll see that we'll see here a little bit of vitalism creeping in, actually in a major way, and how we dealt with that vitalism. And we're going to bear in mind that artificial and versus disproportionate. Something being artificial and disproportionate in this case. So this case involved a patient who was in a persistent vegetative state complicated by end-stage multi-systems organ failure. The patient was actively dying at a research hospital in New York City, okay? And I got called into the case. I know all these cases very well. From something called Graft-versus-Host Disease. The patient's body was rejecting a bone marrow transplant so profoundly that he was rejecting his own organs. And in spite of their very best efforts, the best that medicine could bring to the table, the clinicians were not able to stop this bodily shutdown. They couldn't fix the problem. Within this dying process, the patient's system could no longer absorb food and fluids. The medical team knew that the feeding tube should be stopped. So did I. And they met with the patient's healthcare proxy decision maker to seek his informed consent to do so. Now, the proxy decision maker was in a very tough spot. The patient had made it known both verbally and in his written advance directive that he wanted, quote, everything possible, close quote, to be done for him. And the patient was Catholic, but the proxy decision maker was not. So here you see possibility for some well-intentioned error. Nothing sinful, nothing bad, just well-intentioned error. The proxy had heard or understood that the Catholic Church holds that, quote, food and fluids are ordinary and so they must be given in all circumstances, close quote. That was his understanding. Okay, my friend wanted everything done. Church says this, as I understand it, we got to do this. Because not doing so amounted to, quote, killing the patient, close quote. He wanted to ensure that his loved one's life was fully respected. A very good thing. Respect for human life, right? And would not consent to discontinuing the tube feeding. The proxy's baseline idea was good regarding human life and human dignity. Also, he was doing his best to honor the everything possible statement according to the patient's written request. He was trying to be a high-fidelity friend. However, in the heat of this gut-wrenching situation, he did not understand that the Church's position on tube feeding also takes into account proportionality. That is to say, is the thing in question fitting to the reality of what the patient is going through? Does it fit? He also did not understand that it was no longer possible for the patient to benefit in any way from the artificial nutrition and hydration. As he was helped to fully grasp the patient's irreversible impending death and to understand that his friend could no longer benefit from the tube feeding, the healthcare proxy decision maker was then able to allow the medical team to discontinue the feedings while remaining highly attentive and responsive to the complex needs of the patient. It's very, very important. Some people have a false notion that, if you put the tube in, we do recognize food and fluids given this way to be ordinary. In other words, they're consistent with our human nature, but we also realize they're not always fitting. So, once we knew that, you see, this was a very good thing because the medical team legally was going to have to do a procedure to have the proxy decision maker removed from the case so that they could practice good medicine. And so that we can move the patient from this hospital to a proper hospice modality up in Westchester County. So this was very, very important. Now, once I was able to help the proxy think through that like we've just thought here, we went up and we invited the clinicians, and they all came to the bedside to have last rites with the apostolic pardon, to commend the patient to the Blessed Mother in her loving and maternal embrace, to call upon favorite saints, while all other supportive measures continued. That's key. This was not these physicians trying to kill the patient by starving or dehydrating the patient to death. That was not in question. Their treatment plan was excellent. In the end, the patient's inclination to life and his intrinsic dignity, which we'll touch on in a moment, were fully respected as he was imminently dying, not from a lack of food or fluids, but from irreversible organ failure that could not be corrected. The focus now shifts. And this is where the I-thou relationship is huge. The confidence that we're now in the arms of a loving God, the cloud of heavenly witnesses, angels, and saints. We can have that hope in the resurrection. Not all is lost. Another case, which happened in a hospital right across the street where I was also active, involved the placement of a breathing tube. Highly artificial, and in this case, proportionate. Pro-life, yet not vitalistic. We're going to see a kind of a mean struck here between vitalism and this euthanistic type thought. And yet, a decision taken by a loving daughter against her mother's advance directive, which is legally doable. Might sound horrific, but actually, her daughter did not disrespect her mother's autonomy rights. That should come out here. An elderly woman who had suffered a serious stroke complicated by a history of heart damage from earlier heart attacks had advanced medical directives stating that she did not want tube feeding if she became unconscious, and she did not want to be resuscitated if her heart and breathing had stopped. She wanted to, quote, let nature take its course, close quote. Her daughter and she were very close, and they were both practicing Catholics. The daughter was faced with a morally distressing decision when the medical team suggested that the placement of a feeding tube and an endotracheal tube, a breathing tube, temporarily was very fitting because these were necessary to afford this patient the best possibility of a recovery within a given time frame from her stroke and therefore improve long-term survival. So this wasn't vitalistic. It's like, okay, our assessment is not done yet. This patient is very proximate posterior, right, to this stroke that happened. And we've given the type of stroke that it was. We've got to give it a little time to see what is actually prudent. After a stroke, even a serious stroke complicated by a cardiac history, it takes time to assess the probability of recovery. The medical team considered it most prudent to give their patient the best chance for such recovery by protecting and promoting her breathing, providing proper nutrition and palliative support. Now that the daughter, as healthcare proxy decision maker, had responsibility and authority to make decisions on behalf of her mother, she was faced with the toughest decision of her life, a decision requiring prudence, courage, and love. Sidebar irony. One of the doctors on that team was pro-euthanasia. So somebody who's pro-euthanasia isn't always going to take immediate euthanistic activity at the bedside. That's how weird it can be. She had to decide whether to give informed consent for these two caring, artificial interventions. Notwithstanding what the advanced medical directive stated, what would her mother want? Here and now, if she knew the facts. Sidebar comment, and we can get into this in the Q&A. Probably the most important thing you can do in planning for the future is make sure you have a primary, secondary, and maybe even tertiary healthcare proxy decisions named legally in your estate planning so that that person can think on your behalf when you can no longer do so in real time. Knowing you, someone you trust who can help achieve good real-time, in-context decisions that are also objectively, in the nature of the actions themselves, excellent. Again, the nature of the actions, the circumstances, and the intentions. Name a proxy. You see, she had written of a disinclination for these types of interventions, that is to say, the mother. And yet, promotion and protection of breathing and vitally important nutritional support by artificial devices were being proposed as necessary parts of actions that were consistent with her human nature, specifically the inclination to self-preservation. Supported breathing and supported eating were proportionate to her mother's realistic hope of recovery, given the probabilities understood by the physicians. Are the physicians perfect? No. But they understand the probabilities as based in sound scientific knowledge of human physiology, human pathophysiology, pharmacology, all the ologies you want. Very important to be in conversation in real time with those guys and gals. In other words, it seemed most reasonable and loving to support her mother by helping her to breathe and eat, at least long enough to give those physicians a chance to get the treatment plan right based on the real probabilities of what was being expressed in either a recovery trajectory of this patient or something else. When the patient etched out her advanced medical directives, she had no way of knowing what the actual facts of her medical condition would be, those circumstances. Those directives, as all advanced medical directives, were written outside of any set of circumstances. The daughter had to decide whether or not to give informed proxy consent with the support of her other family members and loved ones close to the case, aided by a true understanding of her mother's desires and the situation at hand relative to church teaching and medical fact. That's why I was called in on the case. They wanted a priest who was also an ethicist there to discuss it within the treatment planning and with the proxy herself. The staff's efforts to educate the daughter were fully consistent with her right and responsibility to make a well-informed decision regarding her mother's care. The mother's advanced medical directives were taken into account quite seriously, with her best calculation of what her mother would likely have decided. Given the circumstances at hand, the daughter gave informed proxy consent for ventilator support and placement of a temporary feeding tube. Hey, once these tubes are in, it's not like you can never remove them. That's a myth. That's an error. Ironically, the mother took a turn for the worse within a few days, during the time the clinicians needed in order to more fully assess whether or not she would recover or have a hope of recovery. As her condition deteriorated, the goals and interventions were modified appropriately toward a palliative approach. The patient died of heart failure just a few days later. While support was maintained, cardiopulmonary resuscitation was not initiated, in full and prudent accord with her advanced medical directive, considering her active demise and her complex medical history. Prior to the patient's death, she was anointed and given the apostolic pardon as part of the last rites. She and her daughter and loving family members were blessed every day by not just me, but other chaplains, ministers who would visit. As far as can be known, she died in peace with hope for resurrection intact. Her loved ones and clinicians together shed tears and said hope-filled post-mortem prayers over her mortal remains. But you guys know we can come to the bedside and pray for the deceased. So we did that. It was beautiful. It was a holy death. That's euthanasia in a sense of hagia thanatos, right? A holy death, a happy death, a death in God's presence, in the beautiful community of family and loved ones. Everybody. That's amazing. That can even happen in these kinds of highly strange hospital settings. Several months later, the daughter sent a thank you card. She was grateful for the help she had received in making the right decision during the most difficult time of her life. While she had found herself in moral distress several months earlier, that distress was now replaced with the confidence that she had truly done her best for her mother. Moreover, she was convinced that her mother would have asked for the same care had she been able to do so, even though her, previously written advanced medical directive stated something different. Her daughter had acted neither vitalistically nor euthanistically on behalf of her beloved mother. She took decisions that were fitting. She took decisions that were fully respected of her mother's dignity, that were fully grounded in love and fully consistent with what we know of the best that scientifically grounded medicine and nursing and allied health practice can bring all that can bring to the bedside of a patient who would, in her case, end up dying. And so she was able to make a morally sound decision based on accurate information in her mother's best interest. Now, there's also a distinction here. We're talking about dignity that is drawn between intrinsic dignity and attributed dignity. During a town hall meeting shortly before the 2016 New Hampshire primary election, a, quote, terminally ill, close quote, gentleman raised a heartfelt question regarding, quote, death with dignity, close quote. And you could tell in the question, I don't know if any of you watched that town hall, it was very apparent. I'm pretty able to read people. It was apparent that this guy wanted to see, death with dignity laws. They call it aid in dying, assisted suicide, which is legal in several states. And goes back, Father, I hear what you said, but actually historically, this problem goes back quite a ways. I could touch on that a little bit later. But to cut to the chase, this guy wanted to hear something, and he didn't get what he wanted. Because regardless of what you think of her, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is a pretty good politician in some ways. Very crafty. She thanked the gentleman and noted that this is a tricky matter that needs to be thought through very carefully. She affirmed his distress, but she did not take the bait. When you're running for president, that's a pretty good move. Now, as I heard this exchange, the theological distinction between intrinsic dignity and attributed dignity came immediately to mind. Humans have two types of dignity: attributed dignity and intrinsic dignity. Attributed dignity can be gained and lost. For example, the chief of surgery at a given hospital has attributed dignity in accord with her position. Being a chief of surgery is a dignified thing. Right? We have two pastors. They have the dignity that goes with that office, that goes with the care of souls. That's highly dignified. In an attributed sense, we would rightly say they have greater attributed dignity when it comes to care of souls than do I. I'm not a pastor. So there's a different attribution, and that's proper. That's why if I see the Pope, I kiss his ring. That's why when I was a naval officer, an Earth Corps officer, if I saw a superior officer, I saluted the uniform. All these kinds of attributed dignity. It's real. This is both a dignity that she lacked prior to becoming chief of surgery and a dignity that she will eventually lose. If attributed dignity is understood as the sole aspect or the whole of human dignity, then one might logically, right, validly, in its logical validity, hold that the chief of surgery suffers a significant and in time perhaps a permanent loss of rational capacity. Her dignity will have been greatly reduced, if not completely lost. Boy, it sounds like there could be something of a death without dignity here. In recognizing this possibility, one may posit that she should be allowed to plan ahead for such a loss of dignity by putting advanced medical directives in play, enabling someone to help her end her, quote, undignified life at some future point. The problem here is it's all based in qualities, attributes, rather than the substance of the human person, rather than the human nature that I have. So it's kind of like throwaway society. We see so many examples of this. Elderly sometimes just sent away and initially visited a lot but then ignored. We can see a lot of this. All of a sudden don't worry, I'm not married, I'm a priest. But all of a sudden my wife doesn't look like she did when she was 30, and so I decide to upgrade to a better model. Now that's terrible, but it happens, no fault divorce. She's lost it, right? This line of thought proceeds from a far too narrow account of human dignity, in which the absence or existence of a patient's dignity is determined by qualities rather than substance. Although a permanent loss of rational capacity would occasion a tremendous loss of attributed dignity, intrinsic dignity always remains. To cut to the chase, all human beings are created by God in His image, loved by God as His children, and called by God to eternal union with Him. God endows all humans with equal dignity as His children. Even the unbaptized, He desires all to come to Him. Of course, as tragic as is a tremendous loss of attributed dignity in a loved one because of illness or disability, the proper response is to strive intelligently and lovingly to help that person encounter God's love in accord with his or her God-given intrinsic dignity. This love of God is made present and tangible through each person who actively provides care for a suffering loved one. While attributed dignity can be and will be lost, what remains is an equally real and far more permanent intrinsic dignity, which is bestowed by God upon every person. Now, this is not the slam attributed dignity. Without it, we don't have medals of honor. We don't have heroes. We don't have legends. We lose a lot of our ability to see what excellence is. It's important, but it's not the whole of the story. Now, there is another distinction I can cover, but I've been talking a while. This distinction is between freedom for excellence and as distinct from autonomy. And I look at two cases, one involving an act of suicide that took place in the late 70s and was highly publicized, and the other, an end-of-life case that didn't play out that way at all. I'm going to try to just cut to the chase on this. Autonomy, what is it? Autonomos, self-rule. It's the ability to make choices without what some might call paternalistic or maternalistic or coercive interference. Now, within healthcare in the United States, respect for autonomy is accepted as the theoretical basis of informed consent. This is important. There was a guy named Henry Beecher in the 60s who had a groundbreaking article. I can't remember if it was in the Journal of the American Medical Association or the New England Journal, but it was in a major journal, I'm just forgetting my source right now, on all these abuses that had happened with research subjects and others. Also, you can think back to like the Tuskegee syphilis experiments right here in the United States. There have been multitude of problems that date back, going back really to academic medicine, dealing with eugenics in the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany. So even Hitler, people want to talk about Hitler. Hitler tapped into what already was there. And he just unleashed some things in a very frightening way. But in these other areas too, this kind of thought has been on the table. But you see, autonomy is important, right? Because if I don't respect your autonomy, and we're going to see here that it's part but not whole of human freedom, if I don't respect your autonomy, I can coerce you. And people don't want to be coerced for good reason. If I coerce you, I'm violating you. I'm violating you as a social animal. I'm violating you as my equal. I'm now just imposing something on you. Now, when autonomy is conflated with freedom, any limitation placed on personal autonomous choices ought to curtail freedom. Back in 1982, in his book, Who Should Decide Paternalism in Healthcare, James Childress, a leading bioethicist, presents a case of Joe Roman to illustrate that suicide, assisted or unassisted, may flow out of an autonomous choice that ought to be respected by healthcare professionals. Obviously, I don't agree with that. On the 9th of June in 1979, artist Joe Roman, at 62 years old, began fashioning her life sculpture, a pine coffin-like box filled with personal mementos with the help of her family and close friends. Early the next morning, having finished her project, written a farewell letter to 60 friends, and said goodbye to her family, she swallowed 35 sleeping pills washed down with champagne. She had planned her death for 15 months. It was her view that life can be transformed into art. Word on that in a moment. And that a person should take command of making life's final brushstroke as an autonomous agent. Her original plan had been to end her life at age 75. But when she learned in March of 78 that she had breast cancer, which had spread through her lymph nodes, she decided to, quote, make the best possible calculation of a time frame within which she might count reasonably on being able to function to her satisfaction, close quote. It is significant to note that Roman's autopsy later indicated that her breast cancer had not spread throughout her body and death was not imminent. She said in her farewell letter that she had, quote, concluded that suicide need not be pathological, that rational suicide makes possible a truly ideal closing of one's lifespan, close quote. Now, this wasn't just in Childress's book. It was put in that book, but it was taken out of articles that hit the press. And New York Times of 17 June 79, Newsweek of 2 July 79, to name but a couple. She was described as her friends as anything but morbid and as a talented artist with a large lust for life. Her suicide note, which had been notarized 2 days before her death, detailed her plans and stated that she wanted to spare herself and her family and her friends the ravages of cancer. It was also intended to absolve those close to her of any complicity in her suicide because this was not legal. She had undergone 10 months of chemotherapy before deciding to end treatment. She later wrote, here's what she perceived. Quote, "My medical team believed they had more right than I to command my life," close quote. Whether she was right or wrong, I don't know the facts of that, and that's what she perceived. When freedom is equated with autonomy, denying Roman her wish to commit suicide is seen as a violation of her freedom to end her life on her own terms. Because Roman had sufficient decisional capacity, it is clear that she autonomously chose to kill herself with the collaborative support of her supposed loved ones. Respectful of personal autonomy, well-intentioned people, including some clinicians, are often careful to avoid undue influence over patients like Roman who are considering such options. The major premise here, the rationale is simple. Killing oneself is seen to be objectively neutral. It's seen to be one option among others that on grounds of human freedom understood this way should be allowed for a person to choose. It's kind of like almost like, if you think politically, a libertarian expansion of things that are able to be chosen based on what the individual wants. So therefore, because Roman autonomously asserted suicide to be a personal benefit rather than a setback, her supporters caused her no harm. Now that's in Beecham and Childress's later book, Principles of Biomedical Ethics. And Beecham and Childress, if you don't know who they are, they're giants in the history of bioethics here in the United States. The prima facie principles, all that stuff. This line of thought has significant limitations. It risks leaving the patient inadequately informed because it does not facilitate a patient's natural ability to consider a richer range of options. It says, like, that's what you want? Okay, we're going to do it. Thus, the patient is at risk for autonomously but erroneously concluding that voluntary death is a good option. Erroneously? How so? Human nature. Human nature-based activity. Father Thumbnail sketched it as natural law. What is natural law? Autonomy plus theonomy. Your law plus God's law working together. My participation in the divine law equals human freedom for excellence. So autonomy is part of human freedom for excellence, but not the whole of it. And as seen, why is this important? As seen in the data regarding cases of assisted suicide in Oregon and Washington, the fear of losing autonomy has a significant effect on patients who choose assisted suicide. In both of those places, right? And it's legal elsewhere, but these two go back the furthest. Oregon, it's been legal since about 98, if I'm remembering right, almost 20 years. Every year when patients are asked who seek assisted suicide, they're asked, why are you seeking this? What is it you seek? What are your concerns? Their number one concern, or very close to it, year in and year out, is the fear of losing autonomy. And the things that follow closely behind that are closely correlative to that. Becoming less able to do joyful activities, loss of control over bodily functions. The basic fear of moving from being an agent to being a patient. I can do things, now I can no longer do things. That's horrifying. If you know, I'm sure you would agree, that's a pretty horrifying prospect. Nobody would choose that. That's a real fear. Also in Washington, where it's been legal for, I want to say, about 8 years, the numbers are similar. So, is it really this simple? Does freedom only encompass the absence of coercion, a freedom from paternalistic strictures? Not quite. A person gifted with a proper aptitude to do so can freely learn to play the piano via practice in accord with music theory, and usually some level of expert instruction. In other words, we can grow in our freedom. If one does this, if one who has that aptitude, has that capacity, and by the way, this is one of the analogies that this theologian, Servais Pinckaers, uses in explaining human freedom is more than just autonomy. Okay? How do we grow our freedom? Let's take a step here. If I don't know how to play the piano, by the way, I don't know how to play the piano. I can't sit down right now and play for you Michael McDonald's music or some composer's music. Why? Because I haven't learned the instrument. But if I have the aptitude to learn the instrument, what happens? My range of free activity becomes expanded through choices I make. So I'm autonomously choosing some things, but with a goal to a greater end. I'm growing, I'm progressing. This can even end, we're going to see here, this can even happen as someone's dying. We'll see that in a moment. Doesn't always play out that way, but it can. So there's that. By a negative contrast, I can destroy my freedom by autonomously deciding to use crystal methamphetamine. We know crystal meth is a big problem throughout rural United States. I can do so by having a Skittles party. You know what a Skittles party is? No. Among high school kids today? A Skittles party is, I'm going to go raid mom and dad's medicine cabinet. We're going to put all these colorful pills on the table and just stop popping stuff and see what happens. Abuse of opiates. Percocet, right? Stuff like that. Addiction, right? I can lose my freedom by exercising my autonomy. And if I choose to kill myself, well, I'm definitely done making choices at that point. I've definitively ended it. But there's something more. If I choose to learn the piano, I progress from being a potential into an actual pianist, and that range expands. So rather than mere choice-making capacity, autonomy, human freedom involves progress focused primarily upon what I am free for, and secondarily, what I am free from, a both and. And we're going to see, Father already touched on it, the primary has to do with an I-thou and I-thou relationships. My relationship with God, my relationship with my neighbors. So, to cut to the chase, our final case is of a young woman whose name I have not changed because I had permission not to change it. Her name was Christy Kornowski. At 12 years old, she decided that she would live her life in accord with God's will. That was her life's pursuit. She figured it out. She made an autonomous decision, but not radically autonomous, because it's within the context of a loving family, a loving parish, so on and so forth. Many have really good influences. So she decided, that's my life's pursuit. She began by reading Scripture daily with a special emphasis on the wisdom literature, her favorite book being Proverbs. Before long, she began to apply the lessons therein to her daily life. For example, she saw all other people as her brothers and sisters in the Lord, especially those less fortunate than herself. Like the piano student who must act in response to the notation on the musical pages in order to share the gift of beautiful sound with others, she responded lovingly to the words on the sacred pages of Scripture and other writings by actively participating in her church's outreach program to the economically disadvantaged. More than an avid reader and a church volunteer, she was also a strikingly beautiful athlete who was developing virtues such as perseverance and patience as a competitive swimmer and runner throughout her high school years. Like the diligent piano student practicing in preparation for a performance of the most beautiful of music written by the best of composers, Kornowski was developing a rich foundation of virtues by which she would freely flourish in the face of a brutal illness that she hadn't yet discovered. Now, on the 12th of August, 1991, fast forward, while on summer break between her junior and senior years of nursing school, at age 22, she underwent surgical removal of a biopsy of a grapefruit-sized tumor of an unknown type at a hospital in Washington, D.C. Motivated to continue her nursing studies, she decided in prudent consultation with her doctors and family to return to school. But as things progressed fairly quickly, within just about a month or so, no, she needed to go back, and she would end up actually choosing, autonomously, but also with plenty of support, to become a participant in a couple of research protocols at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. And one of those protocols was designed to help determine, you see, what she was diagnosed with was an adult onset pediatric sarcoma. Very deadly, no cure, very scary stuff. Now what happened was she decided to go into the research protocols, not in unrealistic hope. Yeah, she was hoping and praying for a miracle, but bearing in mind that her participation could help future children. Future children. This is an act of love of others, even as she's facing her own demise. And these experimental protocols were not without danger. One of them was to determine toxic levels of chemotherapeutics. And because she was an adult, you guys clearly understand, she was big enough to take those higher doses, as were the other participants in this study. Rather than choosing suicide as a convenient way to escape things akin to what Joe Roman called the ravages of cancer, Kronowski faced her diagnosis with love. The ravages of her cancer were substantial, frightening, and yet even in the face of a rapid physical demise, Kronowski stayed in touch with close college friends and remained active in her church's religious education, music, social, and pro-life ministries. You see a default setting right there. In a postcard written to a close friend, her love of God and neighbor were quite clear. Hey dude, had a wonderful pilgrimage to Fatima and Lourdes. God is good. We met beautiful people along the way, and we were able to stay in convents in both places. I'm definitely ready now for whatever is coming next in my treatment. I'll talk to you soon, I'm sure. Love, Christy. This was postmarked in November of 92 in Lourdes, France. She would be dead just 6 months later. By the time she had written this postcard, that cancer had spread diffusely. It was rampant, and she was dying. And once back, that just continued. And in addition to these experimental protocols, she began undergoing radiation therapy, because they wanted to shrink tumor size. It was going so tough, and she wasn't one to complain. Her mom asked her how she was feeling one day after treatment. She said, Mom, I feel 200 years old today. She wasn't one to complain. That shows how bad it was going. Also, she saw her own suffering, and even the suffering of her family members in the light of Jesus' suffering on the cross and other scriptural reference points. In May of 93, just a week or so before she died, when she was very close to death, her father said to her, I'm not really enjoying this Job experience at all, referring to the biblical caricature of Job, often considered one of the best examples of suffering that kind of makes you just stop and say, what sense do we make of it? Without hesitation, she lovingly but firmly challenged him. You should be proud. Dad, don't you realize how much God loves you to trust you with this experience? Close quote. She clearly saw both her own personal suffering and that of her family members as part of God's plan, which she was apparently embracing. During her final days, many people came to pray. But what was really interesting, two good friends of hers, one a social worker, one a nurse, came to see her, and basically had a last saying goodbye. And then they said, Christy, would it be okay if we said a prayer with you? She said, sure, but then you got to let me pray over you. When she prayed over them, now at this point, she was within hours of her death. This was like early evening. She'd be dead in the wee hours of the next morning. She'd already had near-death experiences. She had no use of her legs, no use of her dominant arm, only partial use of her non-dominant arm. She looked like an Auschwitz prisoner. She had an epidural line and all kinds of things going for pain. She had, you could see tumors. She looked like she had horns, in her skull and her sternum and everything. She was terribly disfigured. She looked at them, smiled, and said, yes, like I said, now I get to pray over you. As the two finished praying, she raised her tremulous hand and began to pray. Weighing less than 100 pounds, she prayed with an energy and a joy that seemed nearly unbelievable to the nurse and the social worker as they explained it. How could anyone so physically weak pray with such joy and strength? She was in terrible shape, actively dying, and yet she was beaming with apparent joy, light, and energy, piercing the darkness of death's final approach. A profound paradox. She's melting into her mattress, and yet she's on a profound ascent. She's participating in the divine life. This is the good death. And this really happened. She died several hours after this encounter at 24 years old. Now I'm going to close with a closing comparison, and we're going to open for questions. So, Roman's autonomy vis-a-vis Kronowski's freedom. The earthly lives of Joe Roman and Krista Kronowski ended in ways exemplary of two different grasps of freedom and possibility. In accord with mere autonomy, freedom from paternalistic constraint, Roman freely chose to end her life on her own terms. Bearing in mind that many good people in Oregon and Washington who have chosen suicide out of real fear of losing their autonomy, their ability to do things, right? Their loss of agency. One might consider Roman's choice to be understandable and thus supportable. If one were to pursue the question of freedom no further, one would consider Kronowski's pursuit to be exceptional, at best heroic, even saintly, right? Those kind of attributes, those attributes, right? At worst, frightening, given her profound demise. If, on the other hand, one were to embrace Pincare's understanding, that theologian, Servais Pincare's I told you about, human freedom for excellence, human freedom of indifference. I'm using autonomy. It's basically similar. If, on the other hand, one were to embrace Pincare's understanding of freedom to flourish, freedom for excellence, and enriched freedom for, rather than the mere freedom from, one could see the courses of action of these two remarkable women quite differently. Krista Kronowski flourished as seen in her capacity to lovingly enter into a profound prayer exchange with two good friends, even as death was making its final approach. In this line of thought, one might feel sad for Joe Roman, who settled for so much less when she chose to end her life with the support of her family and friends. An ironic, self-inflicted, irreversible, tragic end and permanent loss of any choice-making capacity exercised within the temporal stretch. Krista Kronowski's response to her illness exemplifies what can happen when a person freely opens up to the divine other and many others in real I-thou relationships. Can be that beautiful.